Vince Price was 42 years old and worked as a maintenance supervisor at Lincoln Ridge High School in Madison, Wisconsin. Most people saw him as a quiet man with a worn Ford Ranger, a metal lunchbox, and grease-stained work gloves. They believed his wife Claire had outgrown him years ago. What they didn't know was that Vince spent his nights writing a manuscript nobody had ever seen. On the night of their 10th wedding anniversary, he opened the front door and found the dining table set for two. The candles were still burning, the food was cold, and Claire's wedding ring sat at the bottom of a half-filled wine glass. Then he noticed the safe upstairs was open. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, leave a comment with your country and local time. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach, and if you enjoy powerful stories about betrayal, resilience, and quiet justice, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. The first time Vince Price met Claire Morgan was in the parking lot of a grocery store on the west side of Madison. It was February. Snow covered the edges of the pavement. The temperature sat at 12 degrees. Claire was 29. Vince was 32. A dead car battery had left Claire stranded beside her silver Honda Civic. She stood outside the vehicle, arms folded tightly against the cold, watching drivers pass by without stopping. Vince had just finished a 10-hour shift at Lincoln Ridge High School. He noticed the open hood. He pulled his old Ford Ranger into the next space. "You need a jump?" he asked. Claire looked relieved. 20 minutes later, the Civic was running again. She offered him $50. He refused. Instead, he accepted a cup of coffee from a nearby cafe. That coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekends. Within 2 years, they were married. At the beginning, their lives fit together surprisingly well. Claire was ambitious. Vince was steady. Claire loved movement. Vince preferred routine. She dreamed about promotions, conferences, and bigger cities. He dreamed about paying off a mortgage before 50. Neither goal seemed incompatible at the time. In fact, Vince often admired her drive. He worked hard to support it. When Claire decided to pursue a professional marketing certification, Vince picked up weekend maintenance contracts. When her car needed repairs, Vince fixed it himself. When her student loans became overwhelming, Vince quietly redirected most of his savings toward helping her pay them down. He never kept score. He never mentioned sacrifices. He simply did what he believed husbands were supposed to do. For several years, life moved forward. Their small house in Madison became home. The kitchen cabinets were painted twice. The backyard fence was replaced one summer. Every anniversary was celebrated at the same Italian restaurant near Lake Monona. Nothing looked unusual from the outside, but around their 6th year of marriage, small changes began appearing, changes that most people would have missed. The first was language. Claire stopped saying "we." She started saying "I." "I earned this promotion." "I bought this." "I accomplished that." Small words, small differences, but Vince noticed. Then came the work events. At first, Claire invited him. He attended company dinners wearing the same dark suit he had owned for years. The suit wasn't expensive, but it was clean, pressed, respectable. One evening after a networking event downtown, Claire drove home unusually quiet. When they pulled into the driveway, she finally spoke. "You know," she said carefully, "some of the executives thought you were one of the building managers from the hotel." Vince looked over. "I am a building manager." "No," Claire said. "You know what I mean." He did. She didn't have to explain further. For the first time, Vince sensed embarrassment in her voice. Not embarrassment for herself, embarrassment for him. The conversation ended there. Vince wasn't argumentative. He never had been. But he remembered it. Over the next 2 years, similar moments accumulated, like dust gathering on furniture. Almost invisible until enough had collected, Claire began introducing him differently. Instead of saying he supervised maintenance operations for a large public high school, she simply said he worked at a school. When colleagues asked questions, she changed subjects. When company parties were scheduled, invitations sometimes arrived late. Occasionally, they didn't arrive at all. Vince never confronted her. Not because he failed to notice, because he believed marriages survived rough seasons through patience. That was how his father had lived. That was how Vince intended to live. Meanwhile, Claire's career accelerated. At Horizon Creative Group, she climbed steadily through management. Her social circle changed. Expensive restaurants replaced casual diners. Weekend trips replaced backyard barbecues. Conversations became filled with people Vince had never met. Marketing directors, consultants, startup founders, real estate developers. People who measured success differently. People who viewed ordinary lives as temporary obstacles. One Friday evening, Claire returned from a conference in Denver. She seemed energized, different. She spent most of dinner talking about luxury developments, executive retreats, and opportunities outside Wisconsin. At one point, she looked around their dining room. The room was modest, clean, paid for, comfortable, yet she studied it as though seeing it for the first time. "We could have more than this," she said. Vince set down his fork. "More what?" "Everything." The answer lingered. Neither continued the conversation. Months passed. The distance between them grew, not through screaming matches, not through dramatic confrontations, through absence. Claire worked later, traveled more, answered fewer questions. Some nights, she sat beside Vince on the couch while scrolling through her phone for hours without speaking. The silence felt heavier than arguments. Then came their 10th year, the anniversary year, the year everything finally broke. 3 weeks before their anniversary dinner, Vince noticed something unusual. Claire had become protective of her phone. Very protective. She carried it everywhere. Bathroom, laundry room, garage, even quick trips to check the mailbox. Again, Vince said nothing. Not because he trusted blindly, because accusations without proof felt pointless. Instead, he observed, the way he always did. On a Thursday afternoon in October, Vince came home earlier than expected. A waterline repair at school had been postponed. The house was empty. Claire was still at work. As he walked upstairs, he noticed something strange. The closet door in their bedroom stood open. Inside was a small fireproof safe, normally closed. Normally locked. Today it wasn't. The safe door hung slightly ajar. Vince frowned. For a moment he simply stared. Then he stepped closer. Inside were important documents, tax records, insurance paperwork, property deeds, emergency cash. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Then he noticed several folders had been moved, not removed, moved, as though someone had searched through them, carefully, deliberately. Vince slowly pulled one folder free. Mortgage paperwork, another. Bank records, another. Retirement accounts. Nothing appeared missing, yet something felt wrong. Years of maintenance work had trained him to recognize tiny irregularities. A machine rarely failed without warning. A pipe rarely burst without signs. A loose bolt usually announced itself before disaster arrived. This felt exactly like that. A warning, a faint vibration before collapse. Standing alone in the bedroom, Vince stared at the open safe. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped toward the Wisconsin horizon. The house remained silent. For the first time in 10 years, he felt a quiet sense of unease settle into his chest. Not fear, not panic, something colder. The feeling that events had already begun moving without him, and somewhere beyond his sight a decision had already been made. Vince stood in the bedroom for nearly 5 minutes, staring at the open safe. The folders were back in place. The cash envelope was still there. Nothing appeared stolen, yet the uneasy feeling refused to leave. When Claire came home that evening, she acted normally. Too normally. She kissed him on the cheek, asked about work, talked about a client presentation, mentioned their anniversary dinner reservation for the following week. Not once did she mention the safe. Vince watched carefully. If she had opened it, she showed no sign of concern, no hesitation, no nervousness, nothing. That bothered him more than anything. Still, he said nothing. The anniversary arrived 7 days later. October 14th, 10 years of marriage. The date was impossible for Vince to forget. Every year they celebrated at the same Italian restaurant overlooking Lake Monona. The reservation had been made weeks in advance. Claire had even confirmed it herself. That morning, Vince left work early. He stopped by a jewelry store downtown and purchased a small silver necklace. Nothing extravagant, just something elegant, something he thought Claire would appreciate. After that, he picked up flowers, white roses, her favorite. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. The table at home had been decorated, the gift was wrapped, the flowers sat in water. Vince showered and changed into his dark suit, the same suit Claire once seemed embarrassed by. At 6:30 he checked his watch. Claire wasn't home yet. At 7 he called her phone. No answer. At 7:15 he called again. Voicemail. By 7:30 concern began replacing irritation. Claire was often late, but not on anniversaries. Never on anniversaries. At 8 o'clock Vince drove toward her office. The parking garage was nearly empty. Horizon Creative Group occupied the 6th floor of a glass building downtown. The receptionist was already gone. Only a security guard remained in the lobby. "Can I help you?" the guard asked. "I'm looking for Claire Price." The guard checked a screen. "She left around noon." Vince frowned. "Noon," the guard nodded. "Half day." The uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time. He thanked the guard and returned to his truck. Then he drove home. The house was dark, silent, waiting. The moment he stepped through the front door, something felt wrong. The dining room lights were on. The anniversary table had been set. 2 plates, 2 glasses, candles, everything exactly as planned. But the food was cold, untouched. The flowers remained where he had left them. No notes sat on the table, no explanation, nothing. Then Vince saw the wine glass. A silver wedding ring rested at the bottom. Claire's ring. The ring she had worn every day for a decade. The ring she once promised she would never remove. For several seconds, Vince simply stared. The room felt strangely distant, as though he were watching someone else's life. Then he noticed something else. The upstairs hallway light was on. Vince slowly climbed the stairs. Every step seemed louder than normal. At the end of the hallway, the bedroom door stood partially open. The safe inside the closet was open again. This time it wasn't merely disturbed. Several document folders were gone. The emergency cash envelope was gone. Claire's passport was gone. A second suitcase was missing from the closet. Reality settled in. Not gradually, instantly. She hadn't been delayed. She hadn't forgotten. She hadn't been in an accident. Claire had left, deliberately. Vince sat on the edge of the bed. The room remained completely silent. No tears came, no shouting, no dramatic collapse, only stillness. Years later, people would mistake that stillness for weakness. It wasn't. It was shock, the kind of shock that leaves no room for emotion, only observation. After several minutes, Vince began checking facts. He opened their banking app. The balance appeared lower than expected, much lower. He refreshed the screen, then refreshed it again. The numbers didn't change. More than $40,000 had disappeared from their joint account. A transfer had occurred earlier that afternoon. The destination account was unfamiliar. Vince checked their savings account. Another withdrawal. He checked the credit card. Several recent charges appeared. Airfare, hotel reservations, large purchases, all completed within the previous 48 hours. Every transaction suddenly formed a picture. Not a spontaneous decision, a plan, a carefully prepared plan. By midnight, Vince had called Claire 17 times. No answer. At 1 o'clock in the morning, he called her sister. The call went directly to voicemail. He called Claire's parents. No answer. At 2 o'clock, he sat alone in the kitchen. The anniversary candles had burned themselves out. The necklace remained unopened. The white roses leaned quietly inside the vase. Around sunrise, Vince drove to the Madison Police Department. The officer, taking the report, listened carefully, then asked several questions. Had Claire been threatened? No. Was there evidence of violence? No. Had she taken personal belongings? Yes. Did she have access to money? Yes. The officer nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Price." Vince already knew what was coming. "This doesn't appear to be a missing persons case." The words landed heavily. "She's an adult." The officer folded his hands. "If she left voluntarily, she has the legal right to do so." Vince thanked him and left. 3 days passed, then 4, then 6, no calls, no messages, no emails, nothing. Friends began asking questions. Neighbors noticed Claire's absence. Co-workers at Lincoln Ridge High School offered awkward sympathy. Most assumed there had been a terrible fight. Some quietly suspected infidelity. Others assumed Vince knew more than he admitted. The truth was far simpler. He knew almost nothing. 1 week after Claire disappeared, the first real answer arrived. Not from Claire, not from her family, not from a friend, from an attorney. The envelope appeared in his mailbox on a gray Monday afternoon. Milwaukee law firm. Certified mail. Vince already knew what was inside before opening it. He carried the envelope into the kitchen, placed it on the table, sat down, then carefully opened it. The first page confirmed everything. Petition for dissolution of marriage, Claire Price, petitioner, Vince Price, respondent. No personal letter accompanied the documents, no explanation, no apology, no attempt at closure, just signatures, legal language, dead paper. As Vince turned the pages, one detail caught his attention. A forwarding address, Denver, Colorado. So that was where she had gone. Not overseas, not hidden, not missing. Denver, more than 1,000 miles away. He stared at the address, then at Claire's signature. For a long moment he remembered the woman beside the dead Honda Civic 12 years earlier, the woman who smiled over coffee, the woman who promised forever. Now all that remained was ink, a legal filing, and a city across the country. Outside evening settled over Madison. Inside, Vince folded the documents carefully and returned them to the envelope. The marriage was ending. That much was clear, but one question refused to leave him. Why? Because people rarely abandon 10 years without explanation. People rarely drain accounts, empty safes, disappear across state lines, and erase a life overnight, not without a reason. And somewhere in Denver, Claire was living with answers Vince did not yet possess. Answers that would eventually change everything. The divorce became official 93 days after Claire left. 93 days. That was how long it took for 10 years of marriage to be reduced to signatures, court filings, and a final judgment entered into the Wisconsin legal system. Most people expected Vince Price to fight. Some expected anger. Others expected public accusations. A few expected him to fall apart completely. Instead, he showed up to work every morning at 6:15 a.m., exactly as he always had. He unlocked maintenance offices, checked boiler reports, inspected hallways, replaced broken light fixtures, cleared snow from walkways. To outsiders, it looked as though nothing had changed, but everything had. The rumors started almost immediately. Madison wasn't a small town, but it wasn't large enough to prevent gossip from spreading, especially when a marriage ended suddenly. At Lincoln Ridge High School, Vince occasionally caught conversations ending when he entered a room. Teachers lowered their voices. Administrative staff exchanged glances. Nobody intended cruelty. Most people were simply curious. Human beings always wanted explanations, and when explanations were unavailable, they created their own. One afternoon, Vince walked into the faculty lounge to refill a coffee mug. 2 teachers near the vending machine stopped talking. A silence fell over the room. Then one of them forced a smile. "Hey, Vince." "Hey." The conversation never resumed. As he poured coffee, he heard chairs move behind him, people leaving, avoiding discomfort, avoiding awkwardness. Vince returned to work without comment. The behavior repeated itself often. Not only at school, at church, at local restaurants, at neighborhood gatherings, the story had become public, and like most public stories, it had evolved. People rarely believed a woman would leave a stable marriage without reason. Therefore, there had to be a reason. The assumptions multiplied. Maybe Vince was controlling. Maybe he had treated Claire poorly. Maybe he lacked ambition. Maybe there had been another woman. Maybe he drank. Maybe he hid debt. Everyone seemed to have a theory. Very few possessed facts. Meanwhile, Claire's version of events quietly circulated. Not directly, not publicly. Through friends, former co-workers, social media comments, casual conversations, bits and pieces reached Madison. According to the narrative forming around Claire, she had finally escaped a life that held her back. A life limited by a husband who lacked drive. A husband comfortable remaining ordinary. A husband unwilling to grow. The story spread because it sounded believable. People often mistake quietness for weakness. They confuse humility with lack of potential. And Vince had never been interested in correcting anyone's assumptions. That silence now worked against him. One Saturday morning, Vince stopped at a local hardware store. As he pushed a shopping cart through an aisle of plumbing supplies, he overheard 2 customers talking. One woman lowered her voice. "That's him." The other glanced over. The husband. Yeah. A pause followed. Then came the sentence Vince would remember for years. I guess she finally got tired of settling. The words were not intended for him, but he heard them anyway. Vince continued walking, didn't turn around, didn't respond, didn't even change pace, yet the statement followed him all the way home. Not because it hurt, because it revealed how completely the narrative had been decided. The trial had already occurred. The verdict had already been reached, and Vince had never been invited to testify. A week later, he met with attorney Rebecca Lawson for the first time. Her office sat on the 7th floor of a building overlooking downtown Milwaukee. Rebecca was in her early 50s, sharp eyes, minimal decorations, no wasted words, the type of attorney who appeared allergic to drama. She reviewed Vince's file for nearly 20 minutes before speaking. When she finally looked up, her first question surprised him. "What exactly do you want?" Vince thought for a moment. "The truth." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Good answer." Then she leaned back in her chair. "Because revenge is expensive." Vince said nothing. "Truth is cheaper." She opened a notebook. "Start from the beginning." For the next 2 hours, Vince described everything. The disappearance, the empty accounts, the open safe, the Denver address, the lack of explanation. Rebecca listened carefully, occasionally taking notes, occasionally asking questions, never interrupting unnecessarily. When Vince finished, she folded her hands. "You made one decision I like." "Which one?" "You didn't react emotionally." Vince looked confused. Rebecca pointed toward the file. "You preserved evidence." That word caught his attention. Evidence, not accusations, not feelings, evidence. Rebecca explained further. Most people experiencing betrayal made predictable mistakes. They deleted messages, destroyed records, sent angry texts, posted online, created problems for themselves. Vince had done none of those things. Without realizing it, he had preserved valuable information. Bank statements, emails, financial records, phone logs, credit card transactions, all still intact. Rebecca closed the file. Then she delivered a sentence Vince would remember for years. "Evidence wins, emotions don't." The room fell silent. The simplicity of the statement appealed to him because it reflected reality. Machines didn't care about feelings. Neither did legal systems. Pipes leaked, documents existed, records remained, facts stood independently. Rebecca outlined a strategy, not retaliation, documentation, everything, every transaction, every communication. Every financial movement, every legal filing, organize it, store it, protect it. If questions ever arose, facts would answer them, not arguments, not opinions, facts. That afternoon, Vince returned home and began building folders, physical folders, digital folders, backup folders. He scanned documents, downloaded bank records, printed account histories, archived emails, stored everything chronologically. The process occupied weeks, then months. As he worked, a strange thing happened. The anger slowly diminished. Not because Claire deserved forgiveness, not because he understood her actions, because organization replaced chaos, facts created structure, structure created clarity. The more information Vince gathered, the less powerless he felt. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by documents. Bank statements covered nearly half the surface. The same kitchen where Claire had left her wedding ring. The same kitchen where he had spent sleepless nights searching for answers. Now the room felt different, still lonely, but no longer helpless. His eyes moved across transaction histories, transfers, withdrawals, purchases, patterns. Most appeared ordinary, some did not. A handful of financial movements occurred during the final 6 months of the marriage that seemed unusual. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just inconsistent. Enough to deserve attention later. Vince highlighted them, then filed them away. Outside, winter settled over Wisconsin. Snow covered streets, Christmas decorations appeared, life moved forward. The divorce paperwork eventually reached its conclusion. No dramatic courtroom battle occurred, no emotional confrontation, no last-minute reconciliation, just signatures, deadlines, approvals, finality. When the judgment arrived in the mail, Vince opened it quietly, read every page, then placed it inside a large manila envelope. The envelope joined dozens of others in a locked filing cabinet. As he prepared to close the drawer, something stopped him. For a moment he stared at the collection. Every document represented a piece of the story. Not the story people believed. The actual story. A story still incomplete. A story whose most important chapters remained hidden. Vince slowly pulled out a blank envelope. Across the front he wrote 3 words in black marker. Claire Price file. Then he added every document that felt important. Bank statements, transfer records, correspondence, copies of legal filings, anything unusual, anything unanswered. When he finished, the envelope was nearly 2 inches thick. Most people would have considered the marriage over. Case closed. Move on. Forget it. Vince intended to move on. But he had no intention of forgetting facts, because facts had a habit of becoming useful when least expected. As he locked the cabinet, he noticed one final bank transaction highlighted weeks earlier. A transfer he still couldn't explain. The amount wasn't large, but the destination account remained unfamiliar. Vince stared at the entry, then quietly reopened the file. Something told him the story wasn't finished, not even close. For nearly 3 months after the divorce became final, Vince Price slept badly. Not because he spent his nights crying, not because he sat in darkness replaying old arguments. The truth was stranger. His mind refused to stop working. Every unanswered question remained active somewhere beneath the surface. Every missing explanation, every inconsistency, every loose end. At night, when the house became quiet, those thoughts returned. By 2 in the morning he was usually awake. By 3 he was often sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where Claire's wedding ring had once rested inside a wine glass. Winter had settled fully over Madison. Snow drifted against the windows. The furnace hummed softly through the night. And Vince sat alone beneath a single light above the kitchen island. At first he tried reading. That lasted 2 weeks. Then he tried television. That lasted 4 days. Nothing helped. Nothing occupied his attention long enough. One night, after staring at a blank notebook for nearly 10 minutes, he picked up a pen. He wasn't trying to write a book. He wasn't trying to become an author. He simply wanted to remove some of the noise from his head. So he wrote down a memory, just one. The first time he met Claire, the dead Honda Civic, the freezing parking lot, the coffee shop. Nothing dramatic, just facts. The next night he wrote another memory, then another, and another. By the end of January, the notebook was full. What surprised Vince wasn't the volume of memories. It was how differently they looked on paper. Events that once seemed random now appeared connected. Patterns emerged. Moments gained meaning. Small conversations revealed hidden warnings. The act of writing forced him to see things more clearly. One night after finishing another entry, Vince read several pages from the beginning. For the first time, he noticed something. The story wasn't actually about Claire, not really. It was about a man who kept waiting for someone else to explain his life to him. That realization lingered. The following evening, he opened his aging laptop. The machine was nearly 7 years old. The battery barely held a charge. Several keys stuck occasionally. Still it worked. He created a blank document, stared at the screen, then typed 5 words. The table set for 2. The title appeared almost automatically. Vince wasn't sure where it came from, but once written it felt right. The table, the anniversary, the empty chair, the ending. Everything seemed contained within those 5 words. He began writing. Not a memoir. Not exactly. Names changed, details shifted, locations became fictional, but the emotions remained true. The loneliness, the confusion, the silence, the unanswered questions. Night after night, Vince returned to the manuscript. A routine developed. Wake up at 6, work at Lincoln Ridge High School, return home, dinner, a few household chores, then writing from 9 o'clock until 1 or 2 in the morning. The process became strangely calming. For 4 hours each night, his focus narrowed. The pain transformed into structure. Structure transformed into narrative, and narrative transformed into progress. Weeks became months, pages accumulated. 30, 60, 100, then 200. No one knew, not co-workers, not neighbors, not friends. The manuscript existed entirely in secret. Even Vince found that comforting. There were no expectations, no pressure, no audience, only work. One Tuesday afternoon in April, a small event changed everything. Lincoln Ridge High School was hosting a faculty curriculum workshop. Teachers filled conference rooms throughout the building. Maintenance staff handled setup. As supervisor, Vince spent most of the morning moving tables and arranging equipment. Around lunchtime, he entered an empty classroom carrying extension cords. Someone was already inside. Emily Carter, 36, English teacher, recently transferred from Milwaukee. She sat alone, grading essays. Unlike many people, Emily never treated Vince differently because of his position. She greeted him the same way she greeted principals, or custodians, or students, with directness. "Busy day?" she asked. "Seems like it." She smiled. "You always say that." Vince shrugged. "Usually true." As he turned to leave, a stack of papers slipped from beneath a folder he was carrying. Several pages scattered across the floor. Manuscript pages. Vince immediately bent down. But Emily had already picked one up. Her eyes moved across the text. Just a few lines, no more. Still, something caught her attention. "Did you write this?" Vince hesitated. "Maybe." Emily glanced at the page again, then back at him. "This is good." The compliment made him uncomfortable. "Just something I'm working on." "How much?" "About 200 pages." Emily raised an eyebrow. "That's not something. That's a manuscript." Vince laughed awkwardly. "I guess." "Can I read it?" The question arrived unexpectedly. His first instinct was refusal. The manuscript was private, personal, unfinished, yet Emily seemed genuinely interested. Not polite, interested. After several seconds, Vince nodded. "When it's done, deal." 3 weeks later, he handed her a printed copy. 312 pages, no title page, no author name, just text. Emily accepted it without ceremony, then disappeared with the manuscript for 4 days. Vince assumed she would forget about it, or abandon it halfway through. Most people did. On Friday afternoon, she appeared in the maintenance office doorway. The manuscript sat beneath her arm. "You finished?" Vince asked. Emily nodded. Every page was covered with notes, highlights, comments, suggestions. The sight surprised him. "You actually read it?" "I stayed up until 2 in the morning." Vince stared. Emily placed the manuscript on his desk, then delivered a sentence he wasn't prepared for. "You need to send this somewhere." Vince laughed. "No. I'm serious. No publisher wants this. You don't know that." "I do." Emily shook her head. "No, you assume that." There was a difference. The distinction lingered after she left. For weeks. Months. Eventually, Emily's words became difficult to ignore. "You assume that." One evening, Vince searched online for manuscript submission guidelines, then literary contests, then independent publishers. The process felt ridiculous. He nearly closed the browser 3 separate times, but curiosity persisted. Eventually, he discovered a regional writing competition in Minneapolis. Emerging voices, unpublished authors, submission deadline June 30th. He stared at the application page for nearly an hour, then printed it. The form sat on his kitchen table for 6 days. Every night he walked past it. Every night he found another reason not to apply, until Emily asked a simple question. "Did you send it?" "No." "Why?" Vince searched for an answer, couldn't find one. Finally, Emily smiled. "You spent months writing 300 pages. She paused. "Submitting one email shouldn't be the scary part." That night, shortly before midnight, Vince sat in front of his laptop. The manuscript file waited on the screen. The application form was complete. The cursor hovered over the submit button. His finger remained motionless, not because he feared rejection, because submission meant possibility. Possibility felt far more dangerous. For a long moment he stared at the screen, then clicked. The file disappeared into cyberspace, just like that. No celebration, no certainty, no expectations, only silence. Vince closed the laptop and headed upstairs. He believed the story was finished. He had no way of knowing he had just taken the first step toward a completely different life. And hundreds of miles away, hidden beneath years of unanswered questions, another story was quietly waiting to collide with his. The first rejection arrived 23 days later. Vince opened the email while sitting in the maintenance office during his lunch break. Outside students crossed the courtyard between summer classes. Inside the small room smelled faintly of machine oil and fresh paint. The message was polite, professional, short. Thank you for your submission. Unfortunately, we will not be moving forward with your manuscript. That was it. No explanation, no feedback, no encouragement, just a rejection. Vince read the email twice, then deleted it. By the end of August, 6 more had arrived. Literary journals, regional publishers, writing contests, different wording, same result. No, most people would have quit, especially after 7 rejections. Vince didn't, partly because he wasn't trying to become famous, partly because rejection felt familiar. The previous year had trained him well. Compared to watching a marriage disappear overnight, an email from a publisher seemed harmless. So he kept working. Every rejection revealed weaknesses. Every weakness became a revision. Entire chapters were rewritten. Dialogue improved. Descriptions tightened. Scenes became sharper. The manuscript slowly transformed. Emily Carter continued reading new drafts. Sometimes she returned pages covered in red notes. Sometimes she simply circled one sentence and wrote more. Or, "You're avoiding the truth here." At first, Vince disliked those comments. Then he realized she was usually right. The strongest scenes emerged when he stopped protecting himself, when he allowed uncomfortable details onto the page. Months passed. Life settled into routine: work, writing, sleep, repeat. The chaos Claire had left behind gradually became background noise, at least on the surface. Then one Saturday morning, nearly 18 months after the divorce, Vince saw Claire for the first time since she disappeared. Not in person, online. He wasn't searching for her. He wasn't checking social media accounts. In fact, he had intentionally avoided doing so. The discovery happened by accident. Vince was researching a marketing company mentioned in a local business article. One of the related links opened a conference website. A photograph appeared. The image stopped him cold. There she was, Claire, standing beside a man in front of a luxury resort in Colorado. The caption identified him as Blake Thornton, real estate developer, Denver. The article praised Blake's latest investment project. Claire appeared beside him, smiling confidently. Different hairstyle, different wardrobe, different life. For several moments, Vince simply stared. Not because he missed her, not because he wanted her back, because she looked completely untouched, as though the previous decade had never happened. No traces of Madison, no traces of their marriage, no traces of the man she had left behind. The realization felt oddly clinical, like examining evidence. Nothing more. Eventually he closed the browser, but the image stayed with him, especially one detail. Claire wasn't merely surviving, she appeared successful, very successful. Over the next several weeks, similar articles surfaced occasionally. Business events, charity galas, industry conferences. Claire seemed firmly established in Denver's professional circles. She appeared everywhere Blake Thornton appeared. Photographs, interviews, fundraisers. The pattern was impossible to miss. Meanwhile, Vince continued living in the same house, driving the same truck, working the same job, and strangely he felt no resentment, only curiosity, because certain pieces still didn't fit. One rainy evening that curiosity returned unexpectedly. Vince sat at his kitchen table reviewing old financial records. Not because he was obsessed, because organization had become habit. Every few months he revisited archived documents, updated folders, verified account closures, maintained records, simple routine. While reviewing old credit reports, something unusual caught his eye: a debt account. The balance exceeded $70,000. His eyes narrowed. He didn't recognize it. That alone was concerning. Vince was meticulous with finances. He knew every loan he had ever signed, every account, every obligation. Yet this creditor's name meant nothing. He pulled a folder from the filing cabinet, then another, then another. An hour passed. Finally, he located the original documentation. The account had originated shortly before Claire disappeared. The loan application listed Vince as guarantor. His signature appeared at the bottom. At first glance, everything looked legitimate. Then he noticed something. Tiny differences, almost invisible. The signature looked like his, but not exactly. The angle felt wrong. The spacing seemed slightly different. The pressure marks appeared inconsistent. Vince stared at the page. Something wasn't right. He signed documents constantly. Maintenance contracts, school forms, insurance paperwork. He knew his own signature. This felt like an imitation, a very good imitation, but still an imitation. The possibility changed everything. He immediately called the lending company. After several transfers, a representative reviewed the file. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. The results were troubling. The loan application had been submitted electronically. Several supporting documents accompanied it: income verification, identification records, financial statements, all apparently legitimate, yet Vince had never seen any of them, had never signed anything, had never authorized anything. When the call ended, he sat silently at the kitchen table. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The debt paperwork remained spread across the surface. For the first time in months, he felt the old unease returning. Not emotional pain, not heartbreak, something colder, suspicion. The next morning, Vince drove to Milwaukee. Rebecca Lawson's office occupied the same building as before. Nothing had changed. Same reception desk, same conference room, same attorney. Rebecca reviewed the documents carefully, then reviewed them again. When she finally looked up, her expression had hardened. "Did you sign this?" "No." "You sure?" "Absolutely." Rebecca tapped the signature line. "It resembles yours." "I know." She remained silent for several moments, then asked another question. "Do you still have samples of authentic signatures from that period?" Vince almost laughed. Of course he did. Tax records, mortgage documents, employment paperwork, insurance forms, hundreds of examples. Rebecca nodded approvingly. "Good. What does that mean?" "It means we don't guess." Her response sounded familiar. Evidence wins. Emotions don't. The same principle, the same approach. Rebecca gathered the documents into a neat stack. Then she leaned forward. "If this signature isn't yours, we need proof." "How professional analysis?" Vince listened carefully. Handwriting experts, forensic document examination, verification processes. Everything sounded expensive. Everything sounded serious. When Rebecca finished, she offered one final observation. "The timing concerns me." Vince already understood why. The loan appeared shortly before Claire vanished. The debt remained tied to his name. And somehow, despite years of reviewing records, he had only just discovered it. Coincidence was possible, but increasingly unlikely. That evening, Vince returned to Madison carrying a copy of the disputed file. As he entered the house, his eyes drifted toward the filing cabinet. The cabinet now contained nearly 2 years of organized evidence. Documents, records, transactions, correspondence. Most people would have viewed it as unnecessary, an archive of old wounds, but Vince saw something else, a puzzle. And puzzles eventually formed pictures. He placed the loan file inside the Claire Price envelope, then paused. The envelope was becoming thick, much thicker than a normal divorce file should have been. One question echoed through his mind. What else had happened during those final months of marriage? Because if someone had forged his signature once, there was no guarantee it had happened only once. And somewhere inside those documents, Vince suspected another answer was waiting. He simply hadn't found it yet. 3 weeks later, the forensic report arrived. Vince opened the envelope in Rebecca Lawson's office. The document itself was only 12 pages long, but its conclusions carried enormous weight. Rebecca read the report first, then slid it across the conference table. A highlighted section near the middle immediately caught Vince's attention. The examiner's opinion was clear. The signature on the loan application was not authentic. It was a simulated reproduction, a forgery, not a possibility, not a suspicion, a conclusion. For several seconds, Vince simply stared at the page. The words didn't shock him. Part of him had already known. The report merely transformed intuition into fact. Rebecca folded her hands. "Now we have something." Vince nodded. "What happens next?" "Now we find out who benefited." The answer sounded simple. In reality, it wasn't. Forgeries rarely existed alone. They were usually attached to money, and money always left traces. The question wasn't whether someone had forged Vince's signature. The question was why, and where the money had gone. Rebecca immediately requested additional records from the lender. The response arrived 9 days later. transaction histories, transfer authorizations, account information, dozens of pages. Vince spent an entire weekend reviewing them. By Sunday evening, a pattern began emerging. The $70,000 loan had not remained in a single account. The funds moved, several transfers, several destinations, different entities, different names. The structure looked unnecessarily complicated, almost deliberate, like someone attempting to create distance between the source and the destination. The trail eventually led to a business name Vince had never seen before, Silver Ridge Consulting, LLC. The company address pointed to a small office suite in Denver. At first glance, the business appeared legitimate. A registered corporation, basic website, business licenses, normal paperwork. Yet something felt off. The company seemed strangely invisible. Minimal online presence, no public projects, no employee profiles, no meaningful history, almost as though it existed primarily on paper. Rebecca noticed the same thing. "This may be nothing," she said, "but I don't think it's nothing." Neither did Vince. The next few weeks became an exercise in patience, records requests, corporate filings, financial research. The process moved slowly, sometimes painfully slowly. Yet Vince had learned something important over the previous 2 years. Impatience created mistakes. Facts arrived on their own schedule. So he waited, and worked, and continued writing. Because something else had quietly developed in the background. The manuscript, the table set for 2. Months earlier, Vince had submitted it to the Minneapolis competition, then almost forgotten about it. After multiple rejections, expectations had disappeared. Life felt easier without them. Then one Tuesday afternoon, an unfamiliar number appeared on his phone. Vince almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, he answered. "Hello," a woman's voice responded. "May I speak with Vince Price?" "This is Vince. My name is Sophia Bennett." The name meant nothing initially. Then she continued. "I'm a senior editor with Great Lakes Publishing in Chicago." Vince sat up slightly. Across the maintenance office, 2 custodians discussed supply orders. Outside, students crossed the parking lot. The ordinary world continued moving. Yet suddenly, everything felt distant. Sophia continued speaking. "We recently reviewed your manuscript submission." Vince remained silent, not because he lacked interest, because he didn't trust his own expectations. Too many rejection emails had taught him caution. Sophia laughed softly. "Usually authors sound more excited at this point." Vince glanced toward the window. "What point?" "The point where I tell you we'd like to discuss a publishing contract." The words landed slowly, almost unrealistically. For a moment, he wondered whether he had misunderstood. "You're serious?" "Very." The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. Sophia explained everything: editorial revisions, publication timelines, marketing considerations, distribution, bookstore placement, future possibilities. Most of it sounded overwhelming. At one point, Vince reached for a notepad simply to keep track. When the call ended, he sat alone for several minutes. The office suddenly felt smaller, not because anything had changed, because possibility had entered the room. That evening, he drove home through light rain. Madison's streets reflected yellow traffic lights. Everything appeared ordinary, yet internally something had shifted. 5 years earlier, Claire had left him sitting alone at an anniversary table. Now a publishing company wanted his story. The irony wasn't lost on him. When he arrived home, Emily Carter was the first person he called. She answered immediately. "Hello." "They want it." A pause, then "I knew it." "You didn't know it." "I absolutely knew it." Vince laughed for the first time all day. The sound surprised even him. For nearly an hour they discussed contracts and possibilities. Then the conversation drifted elsewhere: writing, teaching, life, the future. When the call finally ended, Vince noticed something. He felt lighter, not because success solved everything, because it proved something important. The worst event of his life had produced something valuable: meaning, purpose, movement. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. Several days later, Rebecca called with another update. This one was far more troubling. The Denver company connected to the loan wasn't entirely independent. A financial relationship existed between Silver Ridge Consulting and Horizon Creative Group, Claire's former employer. The connection wasn't obvious, but it was real. consulting agreements, contract payments, vendor relationships. Enough overlap to raise questions, lots of questions. Vince listened carefully as Rebecca explained the findings. When she finished, silence filled the line. Finally, he spoke. "You think Claire was involved?" Rebecca answered carefully. "I think we don't know enough yet." It was a lawyer's response, precise, measured, frustrating. Yet Vince respected it, because assumptions had no value. Evidence did. The following month brought more discoveries, small discoveries, fragments, pieces, nothing decisive, yet each new fact seemed to point in the same direction. Financial irregularities, unusual transfers, questionable documentation. The picture remained incomplete, but its outline was becoming visible. Then Rebecca called again. This time her tone sounded different, more serious. "We need to meet." The meeting occurred on a Thursday afternoon. When Vince entered the conference room, a thick folder already waited on the table. Rebecca pushed it toward him. "Someone contacted me." "Who?" "A former employee of Horizon Creative Group." Vince frowned. Rebecca opened the folder. Inside sat printed emails, financial summaries, internal correspondence, documents Vince had never seen. "The man's name is Nathan Brooks." The name meant nothing. Rebecca continued. "He worked in accounting." Vince listened. Apparently, Nathan had left Horizon 2 years earlier. Since then, he had avoided involvement, avoided attention, avoided risk. But recent developments had changed his mind, particularly after learning lawyers were examining old financial records. "What does he know?" Vince asked. Rebecca's expression remained unreadable. "He claims Horizon had concerns about Claire before she left Wisconsin." The room fell silent. "What kind of concerns?" Rebecca slowly closed the folder. "The kind that could explain a lot." Several days later, Nathan agreed to meet. Not at an office, not publicly, a quiet diner outside Milwaukee. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. Nathan appeared nervous from the moment he arrived. He checked windows, doors, parking lots, as though expecting trouble. Most of the conversation remained cautious, general, incomplete, until the very end. Then Nathan reached into his backpack, removed a small black USB drive, and placed it on the table. The device looked ordinary, cheap, forgettable. Yet Nathan stared at it as though it weighed 50 pounds. "This is why I agreed to come." Vince looked down. "What is it?" Nathan exhaled slowly. "Everything I should have reported years ago." Then he stood, left cash beside his coffee cup, and walked out without another word. The USB remained on the table between Vince and Rebecca, small, silent, potentially explosive. And for the first time since Claire disappeared, Vince sensed he was standing very close to the truth. The black USB drive sat on Vince Price's kitchen table for nearly 12 hours before he plugged it into a computer. Not because he was afraid, because he was careful. Over the previous 5 years, Vince had learned that information was most dangerous when approached carelessly. Nathan Brooks had looked genuinely nervous, not dramatic, not theatrical, nervous. There was a difference. The kind of nervousness Vince had seen in students right before admitting they had broken something expensive. The kind that came from knowing consequences were real. So Vince waited. The following morning he drove to Milwaukee. Rebecca Lawson had already arranged access to a secure computer system through a forensic consultant she trusted. If the USB contained malware, hidden files, or anything questionable, they wanted precautions in place. By 10 o'clock, Vince sat inside a small conference room watching a technician examine the drive. The process felt slower than necessary. Every file was scanned, copied, verified, then finally opened. The first folder appeared, accounting records. The second folder contained email archives. The third held transaction spreadsheets. The fourth contained internal financial reviews. Nathan had not exaggerated. The USB was substantial, very substantial. For nearly 3 hours, Rebecca, Vince, and the consultant reviewed materials. The deeper they looked, the more troubling things became. Several internal Horizon Creative Group emails referenced irregular expenditures, marketing budgets that didn't match invoices, vendor payments routed through unusual channels, consulting fees with limited documentation. At first, none of that seemed directly connected to Claire. Then her name appeared. Once, then again, then repeatedly. Not as a criminal, not as an accused employee, as a manager who approved transactions. Some of the emails showed executives questioning financial discrepancies. Others discussed incomplete records. One message from an internal auditor stood out. The subject line read, "Requires immediate review." Vince read the message carefully. The auditor requested clarification regarding payments made to Silver Ridge Consulting, LLC, the same company connected to the forged loan, the same company connected to Denver, the same company that barely seemed to exist. Silence filled the room. Rebecca continued scrolling through documents. Several minutes later, she stopped. There. Vince looked toward the screen. A spreadsheet had appeared. Rows of payments, dates, transfer amounts, vendor accounts. Most transactions appeared ordinary. A handful did not. The unusual payments totaled nearly $200,000 over 18 months. The numbers weren't large enough to trigger automatic investigations, but they were large enough to matter, particularly when combined. "What does this prove?" Vince asked. Rebecca leaned back. "Not enough." The answer sounded disappointing. But she continued. "It proves questions should be asked." That was different. Very different. Good attorneys never confused suspicion with proof. And Rebecca wasn't about to start. By late afternoon, copies of relevant files had been preserved. Additional investigation requests were prepared. And Vince drove back to Madison carrying more questions than answers. Yet for the first time, the questions were pointing somewhere, toward something, toward a structure hidden beneath years of assumptions. That evening, another phone call arrived. This one changed everything. The caller ID displayed a Chicago area code. Vince immediately recognized the voice. Sophia Bennett, Great Lakes Publishing. "Good news," she said. The words arrived with unmistakable enthusiasm. Vince sat down automatically. "That's usually a good way to start a conversation," Sophia laughed. "I agree." Then she delivered the update. The editorial team loved the revised manuscript. Not simply liked it, loved it. The company wanted to move forward aggressively. Publication, marketing, regional promotion, bookstore partnerships, author appearances, everything. For a moment, Vince struggled to process the information. 5 years earlier, he had been abandoned at an anniversary table. Now a publishing company was discussing book tours. Life occasionally moved in strange directions. Sophia continued. "We'd like to schedule an in-person meeting in Chicago." "When?" "Next month." Vince glanced toward the manuscript sitting on his dining room table. The document no longer looked like a private project. It looked like a future. The trip to Chicago happened 3 weeks later. Great Lakes Publishing occupied 3 floors of a renovated brick building near the Chicago River. The office felt nothing like the places Vince normally visited. Glass conference rooms, modern artwork, writers, editors, publicists, people discussing books as though books mattered. Sophia greeted him personally. She was energetic, confident, the type of person who could walk into a room and immediately increase its energy level. Throughout the day, Vince met dozens of employees, marketing specialists, design teams, editorial staff, sales representatives. Everyone seemed strangely excited about a story he had written alone in a kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning. The experience felt surreal. During lunch, Sophia asked a question. "Have you thought about a pen name?" Vince nodded. Actually, he had. The manuscript had already been submitted under one, VP Mercer, a combination of family names, simple, neutral, separate from his everyday life. Sophia approved immediately. Perfect. The decision offered unexpected relief. Vince wasn't seeking attention. The pen name created distance, protection, a barrier between his work and his private life, at least for now. By late afternoon, contracts were signed, photographs were taken, publication schedules established. The release date was set for the following spring. Everything suddenly felt real. As Vince left the building, Chicago's skyline reflected sunlight across the river. Pedestrians filled sidewalks. Traffic moved endlessly through the city. For several moments, he stood quietly observing everything. The scene reminded him of something important. People often believed dramatic moments changed lives, explosions, arguments, public victories. In reality, many life-changing moments looked ordinary. a signature on a contract, a phone call, a decision made quietly. Meanwhile, the investigation surrounding Claire continued advancing, slowly, methodically. One evening, Rebecca called with another update. Nathan Brooks had agreed to cooperate further. Additional records existed, more documentation, potential witnesses, nothing conclusive yet, but momentum was building. During the conversation, Rebecca asked Vince a direct question. "What do you actually want if this leads somewhere?" The question lingered. Several years earlier, the answer might have been different. Anger, retribution, vindication. Now it wasn't. "I want the truth documented." Rebecca remained silent. Then, "Good." "What?" "That answer." Vince understood why. Truth and revenge rarely traveled together. One clarified, the other consumed. He had no interest in being consumed. The following months became some of the busiest of his life. Work at Lincoln Ridge High School continued. Editing deadlines arrived regularly. Marketing plans expanded. Sophia called often. Emily reviewed chapters. Advance copies entered production. The manuscript gradually transformed into an actual book. Then one afternoon, nearly 5 years after Claire disappeared, Vince received a package. Inside sat the first printed copy, the table set for 2, hardcover, dust jacket, his words, his story, or at least part of it. The cover looked strangely unfamiliar despite containing years of his life. Vince ran his hand across the title, then opened the first page. For several moments he simply stared, not smiling, not celebrating, reflecting. The journey from that empty anniversary table to this moment suddenly felt visible, real, measurable. And yet another realization arrived. The story inside the book wasn't finished, because the truth about Claire still remained incomplete. The investigation continued. The questions remained. The answers were approaching. Slowly, patiently, just as Rebecca had predicted years earlier. Evidence was doing its work, and somewhere in Denver, entirely unaware of what was coming, Claire Price was still living the life she had built after leaving Madison. A life that was about to collide with Vince's in a way neither of them expected. The official release date for the table set for 2 arrived on a rainy Tuesday in April. Vince Price spent most of that day replacing damaged ceiling tiles in the science wing of Lincoln Ridge High School. At 7:12 a.m., he unlocked a storage room. At 9:40 a.m., he repaired a leaking valve. At 11:15 a.m., he ate a turkey sandwich from the same metal lunchbox he had carried for years. By appearance alone, nothing had changed. Yet somewhere across the country, people were buying a book he had written. The contrast felt almost absurd. At noon, Sophia Bennett called. The excitement in her voice was impossible to miss. "We're seeing strong numbers." Vince balanced a clipboard against his knee. "How strong?" "Stronger than expected." Publishing professionals often spoke carefully, measured expectations, controlled enthusiasm. Sophia was doing neither. The first print run had nearly sold out through pre-orders and launch week sales. Independent bookstores were requesting additional inventory. Online reviews were appearing rapidly. Most were positive, very positive. Vince listened quietly. The information felt distant, not unimportant, just difficult to absorb. For nearly 5 years, the manuscript had existed entirely inside his private world. Now, strangers were discussing it publicly, analyzing it, sharing it, connecting with it. The idea still seemed strange. That evening, Emily Carter arrived carrying takeout from a local diner. The two sat on the back porch overlooking Vince's small yard. Wisconsin's spring had finally arrived. The last snow had disappeared weeks earlier. Birds moved between trees. The air felt warm. Emily placed her phone on the table. "Look." Vince glanced down. An online review page filled the screen. Hundreds of comments. Readers describing sleepless nights. Readers describing heartbreak. Readers describing resilience. One review stood out. "The author understands what quiet suffering actually looks like." Vince read the sentence twice, then set the phone down. Emily smiled. "That's the one, isn't it?" He nodded, because the reviewer understood something important. The story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about exposing someone. It wasn't even about Claire. Not really. It was about surviving confusion without becoming consumed by it. Apparently, people connected with that. Over the next several weeks, sales continued growing. Book clubs selected the novel. Regional newspapers published reviews. Podcasts discussed it. Local television stations requested interviews. Vince declined most of them. Not because he lacked gratitude, because attention still made him uncomfortable. Sophia pushed gently. Readers want to know who VP Mercer is. Why? Because they're curious, Vince laughed. They should stay curious. Sophia eventually convinced him to participate in a handful of carefully selected appearances. Nothing excessive. A radio interview, a literary podcast, a bookstore event, controlled exposure. Nothing more. The strategy worked. The mystery surrounding VP Mercer became part of the appeal. Readers speculated online. Retired professor, former therapist, military veteran, marriage counselor. Nobody guessed maintenance supervisor. That amused Vince more than he expected. By summer, the table set for two had become one of the strongest performing regional releases Great Lakes Publishing had produced in years. Not a national phenomenon, not yet. But significant. Very significant. One July afternoon, Sophia called again. This time she sounded almost breathless. We have something. What? A major podcast. Vince immediately knew the name when she told him. Millions of listeners, national reach, influence. The kind of platform that could transform a book overnight. The interview aired 3 weeks later. Vince participated remotely. The host asked thoughtful questions. Writing, loss, identity, recovery. The conversation felt genuine, nothing sensational, nothing exploitative. When it ended, Vince assumed life would continue normally. It didn't. Sales exploded. Within 10 days, bookstores across multiple states reported shortages. A second printing became necessary, then a third, then a fourth. Suddenly, the book existed everywhere. Airport bookstores, independent retailers, major chains, online recommendation lists. Sophia called daily, sometimes twice daily. The excitement became impossible to ignore. One evening, she delivered the news officially. The table set for two is now a bestseller. The word hung in the air. Bestseller. Not hopeful, not promising, not emerging. Bestseller. Vince sat silently in his kitchen. The same kitchen where everything had started. The same kitchen where Claire's wedding ring had once sat inside a wine glass. Life occasionally possessed a strange sense of symmetry. Meanwhile, nearly 1,000 miles away, Claire Thornton, formerly Claire Price, heard about the book for the first time. Not from a bookstore, not from a friend, from a podcast clip shared on social media. The post appeared between business articles and networking content. Normally, she would have ignored it, but the title caught her attention. The table set for two. Something about the phrase felt familiar, uncomfortably familiar. Curiosity prompted her to click. The interview clip lasted less than 2 minutes. The author's voice wasn't included, only excerpts from the book, yet several details immediately stood out. A 10th anniversary, an empty dining room, an abandoned husband, Madison, Wisconsin. Claire felt a strange sensation in her stomach. Coincidence remained possible. Of course it did. Yet the similarities felt unusually specific. Over the next several days she encountered additional references, more reviews, more excerpts, more discussions. The similarities multiplied. By the end of the week, she ordered a copy. The package arrived at her Denver home 3 days later. Claire began reading that evening. At first, she approached the novel analytically, almost academically, searching for connections, searching for evidence. Then she reached Chapter 6. Her pace slowed. Chapter 9, slower still. Chapter 12. She stopped entirely. Certain scenes felt impossible to dismiss. Not identical, not literal, but recognizable. Very recognizable. Events had been fictionalized, names changed, circumstances adjusted, yet the emotional architecture remained intact. The foundation felt familiar. Too familiar. For the first time, Claire began considering a possibility she hadn't previously entertained. Vince. The thought seemed ridiculous, then increasingly plausible, then difficult to ignore. She spent the next week researching. Publisher websites, interviews, articles, anything connected to VP Mercer. Information remained limited. deliberately limited. The pen name created distance, but not complete invisibility. Eventually, Claire discovered a small article mentioning an upcoming event. Author appearance, book signing, Chicago. Anderson's bookshop, 6 weeks away. She stared at the announcement for a long time. The answer suddenly seemed obvious. If VP Mercer was Vince, she would know immediately. And if it wasn't Vince, the question would finally disappear. Either way, uncertainty would end. Meanwhile, Vince knew none of this. His attention remained focused elsewhere. The investigation continued producing results. Nathan Brooks had provided additional materials. Rebecca Lawson remained active. Questions surrounding Silver Ridge Consulting continued expanding. More documents, more inconsistencies, more connections. Nothing public yet, nothing explosive, but enough to suggest the story remained unfinished. One afternoon, Rebecca summarized the situation simply. "We're getting closer." Closer. The word carried weight, because after 5 years, closer mattered. Truth rarely arrived dramatically, it approached gradually. One verified fact at a time. By early autumn, plans were finalized for a major signing event in Chicago. Sophia expected strong attendance, media coverage, regional press, possibly national attention. Everything was arranged. Travel schedules, promotional materials, security, book inventory. The event promised to be the largest public appearance of Vince's life. 3 days before the signing, Sophia called. "You ready?" Vince looked around his living room. Stacks of books sat near the fireplace waiting for transport. "Probably not," she laughed. "Good answer." After the call ended, Vince stood near the window watching evening settle over Madison. 5 years earlier, his future had seemed destroyed. Now readers across the country knew his words. The transformation felt impossible, yet it had happened, quietly, one day at a time, one page at a time, one decision at a time. What Vince couldn't know was that someone else was also preparing for Chicago. Someone holding a copy of The Table Set for Two. Someone reading familiar passages late into the night. Someone who had spent 5 years believing the past was safely buried. Claire had already booked her flight, and for the first time since disappearing from Wisconsin, she intended to stand directly in front of Vince Price. The line outside Anderson's bookshop wrapped halfway down the block. Chicago's autumn air carried a sharp chill. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk whenever the wind picked up. Inside the bookstore, employees moved quickly between tables stacked with copies of The Table Set for Two. The event was scheduled to begin at 6 o'clock. By 5:30, every chair was occupied. Additional readers stood along walls, others waited outside. Sophia Bennett walked through the crowd with the focused energy of someone managing controlled chaos. Publicists checked schedules, store managers coordinated inventory, photographers adjusted equipment. Everything felt larger than Vince expected, much larger. 5 years earlier, he had been sitting alone at a kitchen table trying to survive a divorce. Now hundreds of people had gathered to hear him speak. The contrast remained difficult to process. Backstage, Sophia handed him a bottle of water. "Nervous?" "A little." "Good," Vince smiled. "You keep saying that." "Because nervous people usually care." The answer seemed reasonable. At exactly 6 o'clock, the event began. Sophia stepped onto a small stage positioned near the center of the bookstore. Applause followed. Brief introductions, publishing information, reader enthusiasm. Then she invited VP Mercer forward. The applause intensified. Vince walked onto the stage. The reaction surprised him. Not because it was loud, because it felt sincere. Readers weren't applauding celebrity, they were applauding connection. The book had meant something to them. That mattered. For the next 40 minutes, Vince answered questions. Writing process, character development, themes, resilience, recovery. The audience listened carefully. Several readers became emotional while describing personal experiences, divorce, loss, abandonment, unexpected change. Again and again, Vince noticed something. People weren't responding to the details of his story. They were responding to their own. The book simply provided language for experiences they already carried. When the discussion ended, the signing line began. Anderson's staff estimated nearly 300 attendees. A long evening waited ahead. Vince settled behind a wooden table. Stacks of books surrounded him. A black marker rested beside a bottle of water. One by one, readers approached. Some requested signatures only. Others shared brief stories. Many thanked him. A retired firefighter from Indiana, a nurse from Milwaukee, a teacher from Naperville, a widower from Michigan. Hours passed. The line shortened slowly. Around 8 o'clock, Vince noticed a woman enter through the front doors. Not because she was dramatic, because something about her felt familiar. The woman wore a dark designer coat, expensive sunglasses despite the evening hour, confident posture, controlled expression. She paused briefly near the entrance, then scanned the room. For several seconds, Vince simply watched. Recognition arrived immediately, not gradually. Immediately. Claire. 5 years, 5 full years, yet he knew her instantly. Time had changed details, the hairstyle, the clothing, the way she carried herself. But not enough. Not nearly enough. Claire stood motionless near the doorway, holding a copy of The Table Set for Two. For a moment neither moved. The distance between them stretched across the bookstore, 20 yards, 5 years. One abandoned marriage, countless unanswered questions. Yet Vince felt surprisingly calm. No anger, no panic, no desire to leave, just observation, the same instinct that had guided him through everything else. Eventually, Claire joined the line. The process took nearly 40 minutes. Reader after reader stepped forward, books signed, photographs taken, conversations completed, all while Claire slowly moved closer. Most people would have spent that time rehearsing speeches, preparing confrontations, imagining arguments. Vince did none of those things, because there was no need. Whatever happened next would happen. Preparation wouldn't change it. Finally, only 3 people remained. Then 2, then 1. Claire approached the table. The bookstore suddenly seemed quieter. Not actually quieter, only in Vince's perception. The surrounding noise faded. The moment narrowed. Claire stopped directly in front of him. Neither spoke immediately. For several seconds, they simply looked at each other. 5 years condensed into silence. Then Claire placed the book on the table. The gesture was careful, deliberate. The cover faced upward. Vince noticed numerous page markers protruding from the edges. She had read it thoroughly. Eventually, Claire broke the silence. "You really did it." Her voice sounded older, softer, yet unmistakably familiar. Vince glanced at that book, then back at her. "I guess I did." Claire studied him. The audience around them continued moving. Employees continued working. Readers continued talking, yet neither seemed aware of any of it. Only this conversation mattered. Claire tapped the cover lightly. "You turned me into a story." The accusation arrived quietly, not loudly, not emotionally, quietly. Vince considered the statement, then shook his head. "No," Claire frowned. "No. The story wasn't about you." A brief silence followed. Claire almost laughed. "Seriously?" Vince remained calm. "Very seriously." The answer irritated her. That much was obvious. For the first time, a crack appeared in her composure. "I recognized entire sections." "Of course you did." "Then don't pretend." Vince uncapped the marker, opened the book, turned to the title page. "I never pretended." The response seemed to catch her off guard. For years, Claire had apparently imagined some future confrontation. A dramatic explosion. An emotional reckoning. Instead, she found calm. And calmness often frustrated people more than anger, because calmness offered nothing to fight. Several seconds passed. Then Claire leaned forward slightly. "Do you have any idea what this book has done?" The question carried weight. Not legal weight, personal weight. Vince looked up. "Yes." "Really? Readers tell me every day." Claire shook her head. "That's not what I mean." Of course it wasn't. Vince understood perfectly. The book had forced old events back into visibility. Questions, memories, connections, consequences. Things Claire likely preferred forgotten. Yet none of that changed his expression. The years had removed urgency from the conversation. Eventually, Claire exhaled, then asked something unexpected. "Did you ever hate me?" The question hung between them. Simple, direct, dangerous, because it touched something deeper than blame. Vince considered it honestly, long enough that Claire seemed uncomfortable. Then he answered, "No." The response visibly surprised her. "You didn't No, Claire stared. Why? Vince closed the book gently. Because hate would have kept you in my life. The words landed harder than anger ever could have. For a moment, Claire had no response. None. Then Vince turned the book toward himself, prepared to sign it. The gesture ended the conversation as effectively as any speech. Claire watched, silent. The marker touched paper, and Vince began writing. Neither of them noticed a familiar figure standing 20 feet away near the back of the bookstore. Rebecca Lawson had arrived 20 minutes earlier. She hadn't interrupted, hadn't approached, hadn't spoken. She simply observed, waiting, watching, holding a sealed legal envelope beneath one arm. An envelope prepared weeks before. An envelope containing documents that had nothing to do with books, and everything to do with truth. As Vince finished writing the inscription, Claire's eyes shifted beyond him, toward Rebecca. The moment she recognized the attorney, something changed in her expression. For the first time that evening, genuine concern appeared. And Vince noticed it immediately. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Claire's eyes remained fixed on Rebecca Lawson. Rebecca's eyes remained fixed on Claire, and Vince sat between them with a marker still in his hand. The atmosphere changed immediately, not dramatically, subtly, like a pressure shift before a storm. Claire recovered first. Years in marketing had taught her how to control expressions, how to manage perception, how to appear composed even when uncomfortable. The concern disappeared from her face almost instantly, but not quickly enough. Vince had seen it. Rebecca had seen it, and Claire knew they had. She looked back toward Vince. "What did you write?" Vince glanced down at the open book. The inscription was short, simple, 7 words. "To the woman who taught me silence remembers everything." Claire read the sentence, then read it again. Her jaw tightened slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for Vince. The line wasn't cruel. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't even accusatory. Yet it carried 5 years of meaning. Silence remembers everything. Every missing explanation, every vanished dollar, every forged signature, every unanswered question. The book closed softly. Claire placed one hand on the cover, then looked directly at Vince. "You're enjoying this?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Vince considered the statement, then shook his head. "No." Claire laughed once, a short, humorless sound. "Come on. I'm serious. You expect me to believe that—" Vince leaned back slightly. The bookstore lights reflected across the polished wood of the signing table. Around them, readers continued moving through aisles. Most paid little attention. To everyone else, this looked like a normal conversation between author and reader. Only a handful of people understood otherwise. "You think I wrote the book for this moment?" Vince asked. Claire didn't answer. She didn't need to. The expression on her face already had. Vince nodded slowly. "That's the difference between us." Claire frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I've spent 5 years building something." His voice remained calm, steady, measured. "The book wasn't about finding you." The words landed heavily, because they were true, not performatively true, actually true. Claire seemed prepared for anger, prepared for blame, prepared for resentment. Instead, she encountered indifference, and indifference often wounded pride more deeply than hostility. Several seconds passed. Then Claire shifted directions, a different strategy. "You could have called." Vince blinked. "Called if you had questions." The statement sounded absurd the moment it left her mouth. Even Claire appeared aware of that, yet she continued. "You never reached out." For the first time, genuine disbelief crossed Vince's face. Not outrage, disbelief. He almost laughed. Almost. "I called 17 times. Claire said nothing. "I emailed." Nothing. "I contacted your family." Still nothing. The silence answered for her. Vince nodded once. Conversation over. At least that topic. The truth required no elaboration. 5 years earlier, she had made her choice. History couldn't be edited now. Claire looked away briefly. Toward the bookshelves. Toward the windows. Anywhere except directly at Vince. Then she lowered her voice. "What exactly do you know?" There it was. The real question. Not the book, not the readers, not the publicity, knowledge, Information. Truth. Vince noticed something interesting. She never asked what he believed, only what he knew. The distinction mattered a lot. Before he could answer, footsteps approached. Rebecca Lawson stopped beside the table. Professional as always, controlled, unemotional. Her timing felt almost surgical. "Good evening, Claire." Claire turned slowly. The polite smile she produced looked strained. "Rebecca." The two women regarded each other. Neither appeared eager to continue the conversation. Rebecca broke the silence first. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to speak." Claire crossed her arms. "At a bookstore," Rebecca shrugged. "Convenient timing." The response carried just enough edge to be intentional, not enough to create a scene, enough to establish context. Vince remained silent, observing, always observing. Claire shifted her attention between them, then back to Rebecca. "What is this?" Rebecca reached beneath her arm. The sealed envelope appeared, large, professional, official. Claire's eyes immediately found the return address, Lawson Legal Group, Milwaukee. Concern returned, stronger this time, much stronger. The envelope itself wasn't dramatic, just paper, yet paper had consequences. Rebecca extended it forward. Claire didn't take it immediately. "What is it?" "A courtesy copy." "Of what?" Rebecca's answer arrived calmly. "Documents related to an upcoming civil filing." The words seemed to drain color from Claire's face. Not completely, just enough. Vince watched carefully. The reaction revealed more than any explanation could have. Eventually, Claire accepted the envelope. Her fingers tightened around it. "You're suing me," Rebecca corrected her immediately. "That's not what I said." The distinction mattered. Lawyers lived inside distinctions. Claire looked from Rebecca to Vince, then back again. The crowd around them continued moving, laughing, buying books, living ordinary lives. Meanwhile, 5 years of buried history stood exposed beneath fluorescent lights. "What do you want?" Claire asked. The question wasn't directed toward Rebecca. It was directed toward Vince. He answered without hesitation. "The same thing I've always wanted." Claire waited. The truth. The response visibly frustrated her, because it offered nothing to attack, nothing to negotiate, nothing to manipulate. Truth wasn't emotional. Truth simply existed. Rebecca glanced toward her watch, then toward the bookstore entrance, almost as though waiting for something, or someone. The observation didn't escape Vince. Claire noticed too. "What happens now?" she asked. Rebecca answered. "Now lawyers do their jobs." Again, simple, clinical, dangerous. Claire stared at the envelope. The bookstore suddenly seemed too public, too exposed, too crowded. She was accustomed to controlling environments, controlling narratives, controlling impressions. This environment belonged to none of those things. For the first time all evening she appeared uncertain. Then she made a mistake, a small one, but revealing. She looked directly at Vince and said, "You have no idea how complicated this actually is." The statement escaped before she could stop it. Immediately afterward, regret flashed across her face, because the sentence carried an implication. Knowledge, context, information, things she hadn't intended to acknowledge. Vince noticed. Rebecca definitely noticed. The attorney's expression changed almost imperceptibly, like a detective hearing an unexpected detail. Interesting, very interesting. Claire realized it too late. She recovered quickly, but not completely. The damage was done. Rebecca smiled politely, the kind of smile attorneys use when they learn something useful. Complicated situations often become simpler once records are reviewed. Claire said nothing. The bookstore doors opened. A cool draft entered the building. And at that exact moment, another familiar face stepped inside. Nathan Brooks, the former accountant, the man who had delivered the USB drive. He hadn't been scheduled to attend publicly, yet there he was, walking toward the signing area, holding a book, looking nervous, very nervous. Claire followed Rebecca's gaze, then turned. The instant she recognized Nathan, her entire posture changed. Not concern, not discomfort, fear, real fear, for the first time that evening. And Vince saw it clearly, because some truths arrive through documents, others arrive through reactions. Nathan hadn't spoken a single word, yet his appearance revealed more than hours of conversation ever could. Claire's grip tightened around the envelope. Nathan continued approaching. Rebecca remained perfectly calm, and Vince suddenly understood something important. The story wasn't approaching its conclusion. The real story was only beginning. Nathan Brooks stopped 3 steps away from the signing table. The former accountant looked exactly as Vince remembered. Slightly rumpled suit, nervous eyes, the habit of checking exits whenever entering a room. He carried a hardcover copy of The Table Set for Two beneath one arm. Nothing about him appeared threatening, yet Claire reacted as though someone had pulled a fire alarm. The change was immediate. Her shoulders stiffened. Her attention locked onto Nathan. And for the first time since arriving at Anderson's bookshop, she seemed completely distracted from Vince. Nathan noticed her instantly. An uncomfortable silence followed. Not because either wanted to speak, because both understood the significance of the moment. 5 years earlier, they had occupied the same professional world. Now they stood in a crowded bookstore, separated by investigations, legal filings, and unanswered questions. Rebecca broke the silence. "Good evening, Nathan." Nathan nodded. "Rebecca?" Then his eyes moved toward Vince. A faint smile appeared. "Congratulations on the book." "Thank you." The exchange lasted only seconds, but Claire remained frozen, watching, calculating, trying to understand what was happening, what had already happened. And perhaps most importantly, what Vince knew. The line of readers had finally ended. Most attendees were now browsing shelves or gathering belongings. The formal signing event was winding down, yet several people lingered nearby. Photographers, store employees, publishing staff, a handful of readers, enough witnesses to make dramatic behavior unwise. Claire understood that, at least initially. She stepped closer to the table. "What exactly is this?" The question sounded sharper than before. Rebecca answered calmly. "A book signing." Claire ignored the response. "You know what I mean." Rebecca did. Everyone did. Still, the attorney refused to rush. "Then perhaps ask a more specific question." The exchange irritated Claire visibly. Control was slipping, and people accustomed to controlling situations often struggle when that control disappears. Claire looked toward Nathan, then back toward Rebecca. "Did you bring him here?" "No," Nathan answered before Rebecca could. "I came because I wanted to." The statement carried weight, because Nathan had spent years avoiding attention, years avoiding involvement. For him to appear publicly meant something had changed, something important. Claire seemed to recognize that. "What do you want?" she asked him. Nathan laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because the question felt familiar. "I spent a long time asking myself that." Claire said nothing. Nathan's expression hardened. "Eventually, I decided I wanted to stop pretending nothing happened." The bookstore suddenly felt quieter, not literally, psychologically. The conversation was drawing attention, subtle attention. Nearby people began noticing tension, body language, expressions, tone. Sophia Bennett appeared near the edge of the group, watching carefully, not interfering, just observing, exactly as Rebecca was, exactly as Vince was. Claire folded her arms. The gesture looked defensive. "What are you accusing me of?" Nathan shook his head. "I'm not accusing you of anything." The answer seemed to relieve her slightly. Then he continued. "I'm providing information." The relief disappeared, immediately, because information was more dangerous than accusations. Accusations could be dismissed. Information required explanation. Rebecca glanced toward Vince. The look communicated something simple. Stay calm. Vince already intended to. Years earlier, he might have wanted confrontation. Now he preferred observation. Observation revealed more, much more. Claire suddenly turned toward Vince. A different target, a different strategy. "Is this what you've been working toward?" The question carried frustration. And something else, fear, real fear. Vince considered it carefully, then answered honestly. "No," Claire frowned. "You expect me to believe that—" "I do." After all this, Vince looked around the bookstore, at the readers, the books, the employees, the ordinary evening unfolding around them, then back at Claire. "You think my life stopped 5 years ago?" The words landed heavily, because they contained truth. Not dramatic truth, simple truth. Claire remained silent. Vince continued. It didn't. That statement seemed to affect her more than anything else. More than Rebecca. More than Nathan. More than the legal envelope. Because it challenged the assumption beneath everything. The assumption that she remained central to the story. The assumption that Vince's success existed primarily as a response to her departure. The assumption that she still occupied the most important place in his life. She didn't. Not anymore. And she was beginning to understand that. Several uncomfortable seconds passed. Then Claire made another mistake. A larger one this time. She raised her voice, not shouting, but noticeably louder. "You don't know what was happening back then." The statement echoed farther than intended. Several nearby attendees looked over. Conversation slowed. Attention shifted. Claire noticed immediately. Yet it was too late. The words had already escaped. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. Very interesting. Because again, Claire wasn't denying anything. She wasn't saying nothing happened. She wasn't saying accusations were false. Instead, she was arguing context, circumstances, complexity. The difference mattered, a lot. Nathan noticed too. His expression grew more serious. "You should stop talking." The advice sounded genuine, not hostile, professional. The kind of advice someone gives when watching another person damage their own position. Claire turned sharply. "Excuse me." Nathan didn't retreat. "Every time you explain, things get worse." For a moment, genuine anger appeared. The first real anger of the evening. Claire stepped forward. "You're doing this because you're scared." Nathan's response arrived instantly. "No." The certainty surprised everyone, including Claire. Nathan continued. "I'm doing this because I was scared." The distinction changed the entire conversation. 5 years. 5 years of silence. 5 years of avoidance. 5 years of rationalization. And now the truth had finally appeared. Nathan wasn't acting out of fear. He was acting despite it. The realization seemed to hit Claire hard. Very hard. She looked around the bookstore, at the people, at the attention, at the cameras, and suddenly appeared aware of her surroundings again. Awareness brought caution. The emotional momentum stopped. Almost instantly. Years of professional experience reasserted themselves. Her breathing slowed, her posture adjusted, her expression stabilized. The transformation was impressive, but incomplete. Too much had already happened. Then another complication arrived. A bookstore employee approached cautiously. "Is everything okay here?" The question was polite, neutral, yet significant, because public scenes attract intervention. Rebecca smiled immediately. "Everything's fine." The employee looked uncertain, but eventually nodded and stepped away. The interruption broke the rhythm. The confrontation paused. No one seemed eager to restart it. Claire glanced at the envelope still in her hand. Unopened, untouched. Its presence suddenly appeared heavier, more real. Rebecca noticed. "You should read it." Claire's eyes met hers. "What happens if I don't?" Rebecca answered without hesitation. "Exactly the same thing." The simplicity of the response eliminated any illusion of leverage. The envelope wasn't a threat. It was notification. A process already moving. A train already traveling. Ignoring it wouldn't change the destination. For the first time that evening, Claire appeared genuinely uncertain. Not about the past, about the future. And uncertainty was unfamiliar territory, especially for someone who had spent years controlling narratives. Finally, she looked at Vince one last time. Not angrily, not sadly, carefully, as though trying to identify the moment everything had changed. The answer was impossible to find. Because change had occurred gradually, one quiet decision at a time, one page at a time, one fact at a time. Then Claire turned and walked toward the exit. No dramatic farewell, no final speech, just departure. The bookstore doors opened, cold Chicago air entered. Then she disappeared into the night. The room remained silent for several seconds afterward. Everyone watched the doors, waiting, expecting something else. Nothing happened. Nathan exhaled slowly. Rebecca adjusted a folder beneath her arm. Sophia released a breath she probably hadn't realized she was holding. And Vince remained seated, calm, observing. because despite everything that had just occurred, he knew something important. Tonight hadn't resolved anything. The real battle wasn't emotional. It wasn't public. It wasn't happening in bookstores. It was happening inside records, documents, evidence. And soon those records would begin speaking for themselves. The first voicemail arrived 2 days after the Chicago signing. Vince discovered it while replacing a damaged heating unit at Lincoln Ridge High School. The call had come in during work hours. Unknown number, Denver area code. The message lasted 23 seconds. "Vince, it's Claire." A pause followed, long enough to reveal hesitation. "I think we need to talk." Then the recording ended. No explanation, no details, no apology. Just 4 words. "We need to talk." Vince listened once, then returned his phone to his pocket. The heating unit still required repair. Students still needed classrooms. Life still moved forward. The voicemail changed none of that. 3 more messages arrived over the next week, each slightly longer, each increasingly urgent. None received a response. Not because Vince wanted to punish her, because he had spent 5 years chasing conversations she refused to have. Now legal processes were underway. Facts mattered more than discussions. Rebecca agreed completely. When Vince mentioned the calls, her reaction was immediate. "Don't respond." "You think she's worried?" Rebecca looked up from a stack of documents. "I think she's realizing consequences are real." The distinction mattered. Consequences, not revenge, not retaliation. Consequences. Actions eventually produced them. Always. Meanwhile, events continued unfolding behind the scenes. The materials Nathan Brooks had provided underwent extensive review. Accounting records, transfer histories, corporate communications, vendor relationships, everything. What emerged wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. No secret criminal empire, no hidden vaults, no sensational conspiracy. Reality was more ordinary, and therefore more dangerous. Financial misconduct often looked boring. Spreadsheets, approvals, invoices, authorizations, tiny decisions repeated over time. The review uncovered a pattern. Several questionable payments routed through Silver Ridge Consulting. The same company linked to the forged loan, the same company connected to Claire, the same company that appeared repeatedly inside Horizon Creative Group records. The individual transactions were relatively small. $10,000, $15,000, $8,000, amounts unlikely to attract immediate scrutiny. Combined, however, they represented a substantial sum. More importantly, the documentation surrounding them appeared inconsistent. Rebecca explained it carefully. The issue wasn't proving theft. The issue was proving misrepresentation, unauthorized approvals, improper transfers, potential fraud. Each category carried consequences, different consequences, serious consequences. The process remained ongoing, yet momentum continued building. One afternoon, Rebecca invited Vince to Milwaukee. Another review meeting, another stack of documents, another step forward. As usual, the attorney avoided dramatic language. Instead, she organized information chronologically, methodically. The way engineers build structures, piece by piece. At one point, she slid a folder across the table. Inside sat copies of emails. Vince recognized Claire's name immediately. The messages weren't incriminating, not directly, but they revealed pressure, internal concerns, questions from supervisors, requests for clarification, repeated requests, enough to establish context, enough to demonstrate that concerns existed before Claire disappeared from Wisconsin. Vince studied the pages quietly, then looked up. "What happens next?" Rebecca answered simply. "People answer questions under oath." The statement carried enormous significance, because documents could tell part of a story, testimony told another, and inconsistencies between the two often revealed everything. Elsewhere, Claire's life was beginning to change, not publicly, not dramatically, gradually. The way structural problems appear in buildings, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. Blake Thornton noticed the tension. Anyone would have. The unanswered phone calls, the private meetings, the legal correspondence, the sudden anxiety whenever certain topics appeared. Their relationship had been built on confidence, success, forward momentum. Now uncertainty had entered the equation. Uncertainty tends to spread, like water inside walls. One evening, Blake asked a simple question, According to later testimony, it was the question that mattered most. Is there something? You're not telling me no relationship survives that question easily, especially when the answer is complicated. Very complicated. Back in Madison, Vince remained largely unaware of those developments, his attention focused elsewhere. The book continued selling. Interview requests continued arriving. Readers continued writing. Thousands of emails, letters, messages, stories. Many shared common themes: abandonment, betrayal, recovery. People repeatedly described feeling invisible, misunderstood, dismissed. Reading those accounts affected Vince more than reviews ever could. Because he recognized the feeling, the experience of being underestimated, the experience of having others define your story for you. One letter stayed with him. A retired construction worker from Ohio wrote, "The people who laughed at me never bothered checking what I was building." Vince read the sentence 3 times, then saved the letter, because it captured something fundamental. Quiet people are often mistaken for inactive people. The assumption creates surprises. Several weeks after Chicago, another voicemail arrived. Different tone, different energy, same number. Claire sounded exhausted. Not frightened, exhausted. "Vince, please call me back." A pause, then, "I just want to explain." The message ended there. Vince stared at the screen afterward. For a moment, memories returned. The anniversary table, the empty house, the open safe, the drained accounts, the silence. 5 years earlier, he would have given anything for an explanation. Now the desire had disappeared. Not from bitterness, from acceptance. Explanations mattered less after evidence emerged. Facts already explained enough. He deleted the voicemail, then returned to work. A week later, another development arrived. This one carried broader consequences. Blake Thornton ended the relationship. The news reached Vince indirectly through Rebecca. Not gossip, documentation, relevant context. Apparently, Blake had learned enough to become uncomfortable, not necessarily convinced. Simply uncomfortable. Trust weakened. Questions increased. The relationship collapsed shortly afterward. When Rebecca mentioned it, Vince felt almost nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, just recognition. Consequences again, nothing more. Later that same afternoon, Rebecca received official confirmation. The civil matter would proceed. A mediation session had been scheduled. Milwaukee, mandatory attendance, formal proceedings, structured discussions, opportunity for resolution or escalation, depending on choices made. Rebecca called Vince immediately. "We have a date." Vince listened quietly as details were explained. Time, location, requirements, expectations. When the call ended, he sat alone in his office for several minutes. Outside, students crossed campus between classes. Inside, afternoon sunlight stretched across maintenance reports. The scene looked ordinary. Yet another chapter was approaching, one built not on emotion, but documentation, preparation, facts. That evening, Vince stopped by a small coffee shop after work, a place he visited occasionally while writing. He carried a notebook, nothing more. As he sat near the window, his phone vibrated again. A text message, unknown number, Denver. The message contained only one sentence. "I never meant for any of this to happen." No signature, none required. Vince knew exactly who sent it. He stared at the words. Read them once, then again. The sentence sounded familiar, like something people say when consequences arrive years later, when intentions become irrelevant, when outcomes become unavoidable. Eventually, he locked the screen, placed the phone face down, opened his notebook, and continued writing, because the story Claire wanted to revisit already belonged to the past. The story ahead remained unwritten, and in less than a month, inside a quiet conference room in Milwaukee, the truth would finally begin moving from private records into official history. The mediation session took place on a gray Thursday morning in Milwaukee. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the office building. The sky hung low over the city, muted, heavy, appropriate. Unlike the bookstore in Chicago, there would be no audience today, no readers, no cameras, no applause, no social media, no carefully controlled images, just a conference room, a table, several attorneys, and years of accumulated facts. Vince arrived 15 minutes early, as always. Punctuality had become second nature long ago. He carried a leather folder containing documents Rebecca had already reviewed dozens of times. Most of the paperwork would never be needed. Preparation wasn't about expectation, it was about readiness. Rebecca met him in the lobby, professional as usual, composed, focused. "You ready?" Vince nodded. "I think so." Rebecca studied him briefly, then smiled. "Good." The conference room sat on the 10th floor. Large windows overlooked downtown Milwaukee. A polished table occupied the center of the room. Water pitchers, legal pads, folders, everything appeared sterile, deliberately neutral. The room wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for resolution, or at least attempts at resolution. Claire arrived several minutes later. For the first time since Chicago, Vince saw her in a completely different environment. No designer event, no public audience, no carefully curated image, just reality. The difference was noticeable. Not because Claire looked ruined, she didn't. Not because she looked defeated, she didn't. But she looked tired. Very tired. The exhaustion showed around her eyes, in her posture, in the way she carried herself. Years earlier, Claire had seemed permanently energized. Now she appeared worn down by forces she could no longer control. Vince observed quietly. Nothing more. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just observation. The mediator entered shortly afterward. Introductions followed. Ground rules, procedures, expectations. Everything unfolded exactly as Rebecca predicted. Structured, professional, controlled. For nearly an hour, discussion focused on facts. Documents, records, timelines, financial activity. The conversation remained surprisingly unemotional. Because evidence tends to remove drama, numbers either existed or they didn't. Transactions either occurred or they didn't. Records either matched or they didn't. At one point, the mediator turned toward Claire. "Do you dispute the authenticity findings regarding the signature?" Claire glanced toward her attorney. A brief conversation followed. Then her attorney answered. No, the single word carried enormous significance. Because 5 years earlier, Vince had only possessed suspicion. Now the forgery existed as an accepted fact, not speculation, fact. The room continued moving forward, methodically. Another document, another question, another answer, then another. Hours passed. Occasionally the mediator separated parties into different rooms, private discussions, settlement exploration, procedural necessities, nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Real legal processes rarely resemble movies. They resemble paperwork and patience. Eventually, during one of those private sessions, Rebecca closed the conference room door and sat across from Vince. "They want to talk." "About what?" "A resolution." Vince nodded slowly. The possibility had always existed. Most disputes ended that way, not through trials, through agreements. Rebecca watched him carefully. "What do you want?" The question returned, just as it had years earlier. "What do you want?" At first, Vince said nothing. The answer seemed obvious, yet he wanted precision. Because precision mattered. Finally he spoke. "I want the truth documented." Rebecca smiled faintly. Same answer. Years later, unchanged. The consistency pleased her, because revenge shifts, truth doesn't. When negotiations resumed, Claire requested something unexpected. A private conversation, not completely private, attorneys present, but separate from formal mediation. The request surprised no one. Eventually, everyone gathered in a smaller conference room. The atmosphere changed immediately, less procedural, more personal. Claire sat across from Vince. The silence stretched, long, uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke. "You could end this." The sentence arrived quietly, not demanding, not aggressive, almost pleading. Vince listened, nothing more. Claire continued. "I'll agree to financial terms." Silence. "I'll cooperate." Silence. "I'll sign whatever needs signing." Then she stopped, because the next part mattered most. "If you withdraw everything else." The room became very still. Rebecca remained expressionless. The mediator remained silent. Everyone understood what Claire was actually requesting. Not settlement, protection, distance from consequences, distance from official findings, distance from future scrutiny. Vince looked at her carefully, for the first time all day. Not as an ex-wife, not as a problem, not as a memory. simply as another person sitting across a table, a person facing results she disliked. Eventually he answered, "No." The word arrived softly, not harshly, not emotionally, just clearly. Claire closed her eyes briefly, as though she had expected the answer, yet still hoped otherwise. When she looked up again, something had changed. The resistance seemed gone, not completely, but noticeably. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Claire asked the question she had probably wanted to ask since Chicago. "Why?" The room remained silent. Vince considered the answer, not because he needed time, because accuracy mattered. Finally, he spoke. "Because this stopped being about me years ago." Claire stared. Vince continued. "At first I wanted answers. True. Then I wanted facts. Also true. Now those facts belong where they belong." The statement wasn't dramatic, yet its meaning was unmistakable. The system existed for a reason. Records existed for a reason. Processes existed for a reason. Personal feelings no longer mattered. Only truth. The mediator slowly nodded, almost imperceptibly. Professional recognition, nothing more. Claire looked down at the table, at the documents, at the evidence, at years of decisions condensed into stacks of paper. Then something unexpected happened. Not a confession, not an emotional breakdown, something smaller and perhaps more meaningful. She stopped arguing. Completely. The shift became obvious immediately. No more explanations, no more negotiations, no more attempts to redirect responsibility. Only acceptance, quiet acceptance. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. Financial terms were finalized, documentation reviewed, language approved, procedural requirements completed. By late afternoon, the agreement sat ready for signatures. Several pages, nothing dramatic, just paper. The same way the marriage had ended, the same way most important events eventually do. Claire signed first. The pen moved steadily across the page, no hesitation, no visible emotion. Then Vince signed. One signature, then another, then another. When everything finished, the mediator collected the documents. The process was over, not entirely, but mostly. People began organizing materials, closing folders, preparing to leave. Rebecca gathered her files efficiently, as always. Then Claire spoke one final time, not to her attorney, not to the mediator, to Vince. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the room. Simple, direct, years late, but genuine. At least as genuine as she was capable of being. Vince studied her for a moment, then nodded once. Not forgiveness, not rejection, acknowledgement, nothing more. Some apologies arrived too late to change history, yet they still matter, in their own way. Minutes later, everyone departed. The hallway outside the conference room felt strangely quiet. Rebecca walked beside Vince toward the elevators. Neither spoke immediately. Eventually, Rebecca smiled. "How do you feel?" Vince looked toward the rain-streaked windows overlooking Milwaukee, then considered the question honestly. Not victorious, not relieved, not happy. Something simpler. "Lighter." Rebecca nodded. That answer made sense, because justice rarely feels like celebration. More often it feels like weight finally being removed. As the elevator doors closed, Vince realized something important. For the first time in more than 5 years, he wasn't carrying the past anymore. 1 year later, the line outside Madison Public Library was already forming before sunrise. A light spring breeze moved through the trees along West Mifflin Street. The city was waking slowly. Coffee shops opened, traffic increased, students crossed sidewalks carrying backpacks, and outside the library, readers waited patiently with books tucked beneath their arms. Some carried first editions of The Table Set for Two. Others carried Vince Price's second novel, a novel that had debuted higher than anyone expected, including Vince. Inside the library auditorium, staff arranged chairs in neat rows. Boxes of books stood near the stage. Volunteers prepared signing tables. Everything felt familiar, yet very different from Chicago. Chicago had been a collision with the past. Today felt like a celebration of the future. At 9 o'clock, Vince entered through a side door. Several library employees greeted him immediately. Some had known him for years. Others knew him only as VP Mercer. The distinction no longer mattered much. By now, most people in Madison knew the truth. The quiet maintenance supervisor and the best-selling author were the same person, and somehow that revelation never stopped surprising people. Vince still drove the same Ford Ranger, still arrived early, still preferred practical shoes, still disliked unnecessary attention. Success had altered circumstances, not character. As he crossed the auditorium, a familiar voice called out, "You're early!" Vince turned. Emily Carter stood near the stage holding 2 coffees. She smiled. The same smile he had first seen years earlier in an empty classroom. The same smile that had encouraged him to submit a manuscript he almost abandoned. Vince accepted one of the coffees. "You're early, too," Emily laughed. "Someone has to keep the best-selling author organized." The exchange felt easy, comfortable, natural. Over the previous year, their friendship had grown steadily. No dramatic romance, no sweeping declarations, just trust, time, consistency, the same ingredients that build anything worthwhile. Neither rushed it, neither needed to. Around 10 o'clock, additional guests began arriving. Rebecca Lawson entered first, still carrying folders despite having no legal reason to do so. Old habits survived. Nathan Brooks followed shortly afterward, far more relaxed than he had been in Chicago. The difference was striking. The nervous accountant, who once feared speaking publicly, had gradually rebuilt his own life. Distance from secrets tends to create peace. Nathan seemed to have found some. The 3 gathered briefly near the stage. Coffee cups, conversation, laughter, ordinary moments, exactly the kind Vince appreciated most. At one point, Nathan shook his head. "You realize none of this would have happened if your truck battery hadn't worked 12 years ago." The comment drew immediate laughter, because technically he wasn't wrong. Life often turned on absurd details. A dead car battery, a coffee invitation, a manuscript, a signature. Tiny events creating enormous consequences. The signing event began shortly afterward. The auditorium filled quickly, then completely. Additional chairs became necessary. Readers of all ages attended. Teachers, students, retirees, construction workers, nurses, veterans, parents, people from every background imaginable. Many approached the microphone during the question and answer session. Most didn't ask about publishing or writing or fame. Instead, they asked about perseverance, patience, resilience, how to continue after disappointment, how to rebuild after loss. The questions revealed something important. Readers had never connected primarily with Vince's success. They connected with endurance, the willingness to keep moving after everything seemed broken. Late in the session, a high school student stood near the microphone, 17 years old, nervous, holding a notebook. His voice shook slightly. "What if nobody believes in what you're trying to do?" The room became quiet. Vince recognized the question immediately, because years earlier he had asked it himself. Not aloud, but privately, many times. He thought carefully before answering, then spoke. "Then believe in the work." The student listened. The audience listened. Vince continued. "People usually believe after results appear." A few smiles spread through the room. Because everyone understood, results arrive late. Effort arrives first. The answer seemed to help, at least a little. The student returned to his seat, looking thoughtful. Hours later, the signing line finally began. Book after book crossed the table, names, messages, photographs, stories. By now, Vince understood something important. Readers rarely came for signatures. They came to be seen, to feel heard. The book simply created an excuse. Near the end of the event, an older woman approached, carrying a worn copy of The Table Set for Two. The cover showed signs of repeated reading. Several pages contained sticky notes. She placed it gently on the table, then said something Vince would remember. "Thank you for not becoming bitter." The sentence lingered, because she understood the central challenge. Not success, not publishing, not justice, bitterness. Bitterness had always been the real threat, more dangerous than Claire, more dangerous than betrayal, more dangerous than loss. Bitterness could have destroyed everything, the book, the future, his peace. Fortunately, he had chosen something else. That evening, after the event ended, Vince returned home. The house looked much the same as it always had. Comfortable, quiet, familiar. The setting sun painted long shadows across the living room. For a while he sat in silence, simply enjoying the stillness, no interviews, no obligations, no deadlines, just home. Eventually he walked upstairs, toward a closet he rarely opened. Inside sat a small fireproof safe, the same safe that had once stood open years ago, the same safe that had signaled the beginning of everything. Vince entered the code. The door unlocked. Inside rested important documents, financial records, property papers, insurance files, and one small box. The box had remained untouched for years. He removed it carefully, opened the lid. Inside lay Claire's wedding ring, the ring from the wine glass, the ring he had never thrown away, not from sentiment, from completion. Some objects belonged to unfinished stories. This one had, until now. Vince looked at the ring for several moments. No anger surfaced, no sadness, no longing, only perspective, a chapter, nothing more. He closed the box, returned it to the safe, then locked the door. The sound echoed softly through the room. Final, complete, finished. Downstairs another object waited on the kitchen table. A manuscript, brand new, untitled, blank pages mixed with completed chapters, a different story, a different future. Vince sat down, opened the folder, and began reading. Outside, Madison settled into evening. Inside, the past finally remained where it belonged, behind him. For years, people had mistaken Vince Price for an ordinary man, a quiet man, a forgettable man. They saw the truck, the work gloves, the maintenance uniform, and assumed they understood him. They didn't. Because while others measured value through appearances, Vince built quietly, patiently, consistently, and in the end that patience accomplished what anger never could. It gave him something far more valuable than revenge. It gave him peace. Some people believe the strongest response to betrayal is immediate retaliation. This story suggests otherwise. Vince never won because he shouted louder. He never won because he humiliated anyone. He never won because he spent years chasing revenge. Instead, he kept moving forward while preserving the truth. He worked, he documented, he learned. He built something meaningful from a painful chapter of his life. In the real world, many of us experience moments when we are misunderstood, underestimated, or abandoned. Sometimes the people around us make judgments before knowing the facts. Sometimes the people we trust disappoint us. In those moments, it can feel tempting to react immediately. But often the most powerful response is patience combined with action. The truth rarely needs help surviving. It only needs time. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you, judged you unfairly, or walked away from your life? What happened and how did you respond? Share your experience in the comments. I read as many of them as I can, and your story may encourage someone else going through a difficult season. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's story is about a man whose own family dismissed him as a failure, until one quiet decision changed everything they thought they knew.